Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this James Cooper Creston Academy's webinar. My name's Mike Farwell. I'm head of the Charities and Education team at James Cooper Creston, and I'm joined today by Darren O'Connor, who's a senior manager in our Academies team. We've got a good number of people on the webinar, and we're looking at covering three main topics today. The first is the Creston Academy's benchmark report, looking at the results from the year to 31 August 2015. The second, and linked to that, is some observations on multi-academy trusts. And Darren will close by giving some information about sector issues and other matters. Hopefully you've got some slides that you can see on your screen, and you've also got the ability to submit questions online if there's anything that crops up during the seminar, during the webinar. Just to set the ground rules, we will be saying nothing at all about the EU referendum, and hopefully you will reciprocate by not sending us any questions about that very topical and interesting subject. Right, so if we start by looking at the benchmark report. This report is produced by the Creston Group. James Cooper Creston is a member of this group. There are around about 10 similar firms across the country. Altogether we act for around about 550 academies. So the report is based upon information from those academies. There's a whole range of primary and secondary schools and also multi-academy trusts. Hopefully, I think most of you on the call will have received a copy of the benchmark report. For those of you who haven't, it can be accessed on our website, or do contact us and we can arrange to send you a copy. So the broad messages were that some academies are making reasonable surpluses, but although more than 1 in 5 are actually making a deficit before depreciation. Generally, the cash balances for academies are reasonably healthy at the moment, but I think in terms of what's to come in the future, 75% of the academies are expecting deficits in the future, which is obviously something of a worry in terms of sustainability and investment in the future. Part of this is driven by increased pupil numbers, so we're expecting pupil numbers across the country to increase by 500,000 by 2020, and there was also much mention of cost increases, including pensions and national insurance, which Darren will cover later in the webinar. So if we look in a bit more detail at the survey, looking at on the income side, the general message here is that it appears that the core budget is being protected, so particularly the general annual grant. But interestingly, the Institute for Fiscal Studies forecasts that there will be an 8% real cut over the next 5 years. So that suggests that there will be cuts in various other grants and funding. And Darren will cover some of those changes later in his session. Part of that real cut, of course, it will be driven by the increased pupil numbers that we discussed. And it was interesting to see in the report that capital funding per academy was actually 27,000 less on average in the year in question compared to the previous year. The report also highlights some significant regional variations. So, for example, typically, academies in London receive an additional £900 per pupil more than the average, whereas in the southwest the figure is around about £300 per pupil less. So it'll be interesting to see when the fairer funding review comes through next year exactly what implications we'll have for regional variations. And there's also been some cases of schools asking for parental contributions towards their children's educations, obviously an interesting and difficult topic. In terms of what schools are doing to deal with these income pressures, schools are generally very keen to identify new sources of income, although our report suggested there wasn't huge evidence of significant success in this area. Many schools are renting out their buildings for a variety of purposes, typically secondary schools letting out their sports facilities, but there's little evidence as yet of any trading subsidiaries or major other income that's being generated. Historically, independent schools have managed to do that, and it will be one of the things that we'll look at over the coming years to see whether any academies manage to do the same. Some academies have managed to get reasonably significant donations from individuals or other organisations, so that may well be a focus. And I think again here the comparisons with the independent sector may be relevant. For example, in the independent sector, they have been generally very successful at raising money from alumni networks and also from parental contributions. Of course, there are some incredibly high achieving academy schools, and in some areas these are seen very much by parents as an alternative to independent schools. So it may well be that in these situations parents may well be prepared to make a significant contribution, which will perhaps be a fraction of what they might have spent in school fees if they'd sent their children to independent schools. If we move on to the cost side, of course the key cost for all academies will be staff costs, typically 65 to 75% of income, and it's a key indicator. There's generally pressures, I think, on costs. In terms of the things that we're seeing schools doing, we're often seeing curriculum reviews. We are seeing schools considering class sizes and also the teacher contact ratio, i.e. the percentage of time that teachers are spent actually teaching. And there's been a lot of discussion about teacher mix, and it may well be if the teacher mix changes and you use younger teachers, they may well be cheaper than the older and more experienced teachers. Of course, that's clearly a very difficult issue, but that may be something that happens in the future. There are also schools reviewing the structure of their leadership teams. Of the 550 academies that we looked at in our report, 55% of them actively said that they were reviewing staffing levels, and a high proportion of those were reviewing staffing levels, not just in admin areas, but also in teaching. Our report did suggest, for the time being at least, minimal changes in pupil-teacher ratios. And of course, another issue in staff costs is the question of the ever-increasing pension costs. If we move on to other costs, there was evidence of reduced spend on educational materials. This may be because of income pressures elsewhere, or it may be because of more efficient purchasing. There was also evidence this year of increased administration and governance costs, which may indicate that perhaps the red tape has gone too far. Darren will cover later the position in connection with insurance, where there has been some signs of significant savings. And for those business managers who are interested in accounting software, our survey did cover which accounting software was being used. More than 90% of academies are using 4 different types of software, so FMS, PS Financial, Civica and Sage. So there are some other players in the market. And it was evident from discussions that academies are certainly reviewing their procurement processes. So on the back of those, that information to do with the benchmarking from last year, we're just going to launch a poll to get your thoughts. So the poll question, which hopefully will be appearing on your screen in a second, is: are you expecting to make a surplus before depreciation in the 2016-17 year? So that's the year ahead from the 1st of September this year through to the 31st of August next year. Are you expecting to make a surplus before depreciation? So there are 3 potential options: yes, no, or not sure. So it would be great if you were able to vote now, and it'll see what results that you give in terms of what your expectations are for the next academic year. So we'll give you a few more seconds. For those of you who haven't voted, it would be great if you could do so. Okay, so we'll close the poll now. So interesting findings: 60% of you are expecting to make a surplus in that year, 20% aren't expecting it, and 20% aren't sure. These are figures obviously approximate. So I think that suggests that the financial health of the academies joining this webinar is perhaps slightly greater than the average. So against this background, many academies are looking at other ways that they can deal with it, the financial issues. One of them, of course, is the question of multi-academy trusts, and many schools have taken this route in recent times. I think we're seeing fewer standalone academies converting now, but increasingly we're seeing schools getting together in multi-academy trusts. So this may be a small group of local primaries who get together, or it could be a couple of secondary schools getting together to share resources. And the evidence of our report is that more than 60% of primaries were part of a multi-academy trust and almost 50% of secondaries, and I think we'll see those figures gradually increase over the years. Of course, there have been some high-profile academy change experiencing some difficulties. There are some multi-academy trusts that have up to around about 70 academies. I think they're finding it very hard to control, and typically those chains have academies over a wide geographical area, which of course makes it more difficult to see exactly what's happening. The government sees multi-academy trusts as driving up standards, a controversial topic obviously. And I think that's partly reflected in terms of the academies we surveyed. More than a third of academies were under pressure from regional schools commissioners to form or join multi-academy trusts. So I think there's a message coming from the centre. In terms of the average size of a multi-academy trust, at the moment it's around about 4 schools. I think we'll see that rise in the future. The regional schools commissioners argue that the ideal size is somewhere between 15 and 20. And the think tank Reform suggests that multi-academy trusts ideally might be even larger, at over 30. So I think we're expecting that to happen into the future. In terms of the benefits of multi-academy trust, people will have their own views on this, but I think the key questions are summarised on this slide. Can standards be driven up? We'll wait to see the evidence of that over a number of years. Will multi-academy trusts enable a broader curriculum? I think perhaps the way that we envisage this might work if you had 2 secondary schools, perhaps with 1,000 pupils each, struggling in a particular subject to offer the course because the number of pupils is relatively low. But if they join together and become a school unit of 2,000, it may well make that particular course viable. Economies of scale and shared services will come on to in a moment, although I don't think that's working terribly well at the moment in terms of generating financial benefit. There is, of course, the question of will multi-academy trusts help career development of teachers by giving them greater opportunities. And there is, of course, the safety in numbers approach, where I think some people will see that with the move to multi-academy trust status generally, that there may well be some safety for them in joining a larger organisation. On the cost side, clearly there are economies as part of a larger organisation to improve efficiency, reduce costs and gain economies of scale, although our report suggests that relatively small savings are being made at the moment. In primaries, the figure looks at around £100 per pupil, although for secondary schools the savings that are being identified at the moment are much more nominal. Part of the reason for this is that in many multi-academy trust schools still continue to operate very much as single schools without any real integration. And I think as financial pressures continue in the future, this may change. Just one other point on multi-academy trust. I think typically if an established multi-academy trust is looking at other schools joining the trust, it will carry out some investigation work, commonly known as due diligence, on those potential joiners around financial matters. But I think if you're a school that's looking to join a multi-academy trust, it is incumbent upon you to actually do some due diligence on the multi-academy trust that you're joining, just to make sure that you are joining an organisation that you would be happy to be a member of into the future. Just finally on multi-academy trusts, we'll just look at the structure of those trusts. I think broadly it's fair to say there are 3 particular models. The first is a cluster approach, which is quite common at the moment, where schools continue to operate pretty much separately and autonomously. At the other end of the scale we have a federation where there's a greater degree of centralisation, and then there's a hub approach, which is midway between the cluster and federation, where some functions are centralised and others are decentralised. On the face of it, I think the federation approach has the potential to generate the most savings, but it will likely be the most difficult to achieve. But I think as times get harder and tougher over the next few years, I think there'll be an increasing move to federation status. If you are looking to take that approach, or indeed any of the other approaches, I think some of the key messages will be the need to get buy-in from people. If you were looking to bring together a multi-academy trust of 4 or 10 schools, you really need to get buy-in from the senior teams at all those schools to achieve success. Similarly, if you're looking to people taking on new roles if you're looking to change the structure. Training will be important, and as ever with any venture, it's important to plan if you want to achieve success. Multi-academy trust, of course, a whole topic by itself, so just a few sort of pointers for you there. I'll now hand over to Darren, who's going to cover off some other sector issues. Darren.
Thank you, Mike. So the EFA have recently published a governance handbook, published in November 2015. This replaces the older governor's handbook. It's important to note that this handbook is relevant to all school governing bodies and not just academies. It essentially sets out the core roles and functions of a governing body or governing board, as well as the visions and priorities for effective governance. The new handbook has, in many cases, improved its terminology to fall in line with the movement within the sector towards multi-academy trust status. It also includes some useful considerations regarding governance when you move from being a single entity school across to a MAT. It also incorporates changes in the school environment, including the prevent duty requirements and the Terrorism Act and so on, and also places an emphasis on governor training and the importance for governors to have a broad breadth of knowledge in all core areas, and a reminder that it's not on one individual within the governing body to be responsible for finance, and as a collective the whole governing body should have some responsibility for financial matters. So it's a useful handbook, and we would recommend that all governors and accounting officers review it. Moving on to risk protection arrangements. The government has been in consultation regarding changes to the RPA, and the intention is for these changes to come into effect in September 2016. Probably the headline change is that the RPA cost will reduce from £25 per pupil down to £20. As I'm sure you know, the RPA is paid for through a deduction from your GAG funding. Therefore, schools that have opted into the RPA scheme will now receive more of their GAG funding. Other changes include the notice period to leave the RPA scheme, as reduced from 6 months to 3 months. But there are some additional hoops you need to, as a school, go through, including risk management requirements as stated within the Academy's financial handbook. So our advice in this area is to redo the calculations as to whether it is a good idea for your school to be within the RPA scheme, and whether insurance costs privately are now more expensive than they previously have been when compared. Efficiency toolkit. Given the constraints on funding is clearly important, and the EFA recognises this, that funds are allocated in a way that maximises output and results. With this in mind, the EFA have released a new part to their website which covers off many new resources that they have titled off as Efficiency Toolkit. These resources include useful links to other websites. For example, teaching schools offering other schools advice and support. There's an efficiency metric tool which allows schools to compare their efficiency ratios against similar schools. For example, they can compare pupil results and attainment against other schools with similar funding levels, or perhaps schools with greater funding or lower, fewer funding requirements. Other areas include planning checks for governors, and a list of top 10 checks. There are some useful benchmarks within this report, including staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure, average teacher costs, and class sizes. There are also several training videos that can be watched via this website, including how to achieve best value for money and guidance on preparing your 3 to 5 year planning forecasts. We have detailed a link to this page on the back page of our webinar, and we would recommend it is a useful site to review. Moving on to funding. There are some changes on the horizon in terms of funding, and we thought it may be useful just to recap on some of the key areas. We broke it down there into three main areas. If we cover off the dedicated schools grant first, this will remain within three main blocks. The first being the school block, second being high needs block, and the third being early years block. So starting with school block, there has been indication that there will be reductions in this area, but the EFA have made a commitment that the MFG, or the minimum funding guarantee of 1.5%, will remain in place. Higher needs, more positive news in this area, and the EFA have committed to invest a further 100 million on top of what they had previously allocated or committed to higher needs funding. Early years block has remained the same. The second point there, education services grant, not such good news in this area. There will be a reduction from £87 per pupil to £77 per pupil, which is clearly a significant amount and will have impacts on budgets going forward and should be calculated into your next year budget and forecast, as well as your 3 to 5 year budget and forecast. And finally, pupil premium will be protected per the EFA. So our recommendations, as I've already said, is to review budgets and forecasts and make sure that all is up to date. Moving on to staff costs, there are some pressures in this area as well. We have the new legislation as the national living wage, and the headline changes is that it comes into effect in April 2016 and will affect all employees over the age of 25 who are not in the first year of their apprenticeship. They will now be entitled to a salary of at least £7.20 per hour. This is a 50p increase on the current minimum wage requirements. This is part of an ongoing intention or pledge by the government to continue to increase the national living wage to £9 by 2020. So it may not be relevant to all schools at the moment, but by 2020 there will be a number of staff whose salaries will need to be aligned in line with national living wage. There are further pressures on staff costs, and we've listed a few more below. There's the teachers' pension scheme increase, which is a 2.3% increase, up from 14.1% to 16.4%, and that came into force in September 2015. There's the increase in national insurance. Schools can no longer opt out or contract out of employees' NI, and they no longer receive the rebate. So as a result, there's an increase there of 3.4%. There are also general inflationary increases across the sector, and likelihood is further increases in September 2016. So once again, same recommendations, funding and staff costs need to be reviewed and ensure that budgets are fully up to date, and not only in the next year, but the impact and the multiplier effect year on year within the 3 to 5 year budgets. But also to ensure that you are liaising with your payroll providers to ensure that they are fully up to date and are aware of all the changes. Other sector issues, Mike touched on fairer funding, and we've touched on income and costs throughout this webinar. The fairer funding and national funding formula is on the horizon, and indications do show that across many of the regions that we act for, there will be some encouraging or improvement in funding. However, the details are yet to be released. On the local government pension scheme, you may have heard there are some movements towards consolidation of some of the schemes. No decision has been made yet, but do watch this space. And lastly there, SORP 2015. So this is the Statement of Recommended Practices. There has been a change in accounting standards within the UK, and it's worth noting that the accounts direction for 2016 for academies will be updated to fully reflect these changes. In most cases, it will be presentational changes. We're not expecting many changes to the numbers, but it will all be brought in to the academies and accounts direction 2016. Okay, so I will pass back to Mike now just to wrap up.
Thanks very much, Darren. So we've had a couple of questions come in. The first is, what level of cash balances should an academy have? Of course, that's a great question. Ideally, you want that figure to be as high as possible, but realistically, and looking at the benchmark report, the average for primary schools was around about £350,000 of cash reserves, and for secondary schools it was around about 1.1 million. The figure for primary schools was up a bit on the previous year, and the figure for secondary schools was a bit less. I think, of course, the cash balance isn't the only thing. I think because of the way that the academy funding works, sometimes you do receive funding in advance of the expenditure. So the actual reality is that these cash balances, the available cash, if you like, are really less than the 350 and the 1.1 million figures that I've quoted. I think the key message for academies on this particular point is to make sure that you are planning ahead and forecasting what those cash balances might be into the future so that you can take appropriate action. I think if we'd been running this webinar around about a year ago, I think at that particular point it was clear that some difficult times lay ahead. I think we saw many academies taking advance action and looking to stockpile as much cash as they could because they could see some difficult challenges coming over the next 5 years. And I think we will see through that period through to 2020, we will see whether those academies have stockpiled enough cash and made enough changes to actually continue to provide a great education to their pupils. And other questions come through, I think, which perhaps Darren can take in connection with the education services grant. Darren.
Okay, thank you. The question is, how low do we see ESG falling? Which is an interesting question. Hard to say is probably the first answer. It has been falling, and we can see that there are still some tapered protections in place so that your fall is to some degree buffered off. Sorry. However, it's hard to see in the future, but it does seem as though the trend is downwards, as what was previously maintained by the local authority becomes less and less of or more and more of a moot point. At this point, it's hard to believe that the ESG will continue forever. But good question, and it'll be hard to know and hard to see in the future.
I think it has fallen from, I think it started at 140 now, down over quite a short period, down to 77. So one would hope that the falls will become less. But I think we may well see, in terms of the positioning of education funding, we might well see some of the more central funding not being reduced, but some of the other grants, such as this one, are being reduced. I suppose the reality, of course, is that there are some services that previously the LEAs were dealing with, and it's now up to schools to deal with them. So it is quite reasonable to expect academies to have some level of funding to pay for the services they're now having to find themselves. Okay.
One final query or question has come through is, how many academies are currently in the RPA scheme? Looking at our Academy's benchmark report, it would appear that around 33%, around third, are currently within the scheme. Given the reduction in the cost per pupil, we may see over time that the amount of academies opting into the scheme will increase, and therefore, due to pooling and pooling resources, we may see further reductions in the RPA cost.
Okay, thanks very much, Darren. I think that's all the questions that we've had. So we hope you have enjoyed the webinar. If there are any further questions that spring to mind, then do contact one of us. You'll see our contact details on the final slide. So finally, thanks for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.